There are many benefits and drawbacks to the law of liability in negligence, occupiers' liability and vicarious liability. An advantage of the law of liability in negligence is that it protects claimants from physical harm as shown in Donahue v. Stevenson. Another advantage is that it allows compensation for reasonably foreseeable losses as shown in Caparo v. Dickman. As well as this, liability in negligence also encourages higher standards of care by defendants as shown in Nettleship v. Weston. However, a disadvantage of the law of liability in negligence is that it can be difficult for claimants to prove a duty of care as shown in Hill v. Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. Another disadvantage is that it may limit recovery through policy considerations as shown in Caparo v. Dickman. As well as this, liability in negligence also can deny compensation where damage is not reasonably foreseeable as shown in Borhill v. Young. The law of liability in negligence is fair as it compensates individuals who suffer harm due to another's lack of reasonable care, which is shown in the case of Donahue v. Stevenson. However, the law of liability in negligence is unfair as it can prevent deserving claimants from succeeding due to restrictive duty rules, which is shown in the case of Hill v. Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. The law of liability in negligence balances competing interests as it protects claimants from harm while avoiding excessive liability on defendants, which is shown in the case of Caparo v. Dickman. However, it may not balance competing interests as it can prioritize public policy over individual justice, which is shown in the case of Hill v. Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. The aims of the law of liability in negligence are to compensate victims, deter careless behavior, and set standards of reasonable conduct. The law of liability in negligence achieves its own aims as it deters unsafe behavior by holding defendants liable for foreseeable harm, which is shown in the case of Nettleship v. Weston. However, it does not achieve its own aims as it may fail to compensate victims where foreseeability is not established, which is shown in the case of Borhill v. Young. The law of liability in negligence achieves the aims of tort law as it provides compensation and corrective justice, which is shown in the case of Donahue v. Stevenson. However, it does not achieve the aims of tort law as it can leave injured parties without a remedy due to policy limits, which is shown in the case of Hill v. Chief Constable of West Yorkshire. An advantage of the law of occupiers' liability is that it protects lawful visitors by requiring reasonable care as shown in Wheat v. Laken. Another advantage is that it extends protection to child visitors who are less careful than adults as shown in Glasgow Corporation v. Taylor. As well as this, occupiers' liability also allows warnings to reduce liability where appropriate as shown in Rolls v. Nathan. However, a disadvantage of the law of occupiers' liability in negligence is that it can allow occupiers to avoid liability through warnings as shown in Rolls v. Nathan. Another disadvantage is that it may place heavy burdens on occupiers for risks created by others as shown in Wheat v. Laken. As well as this, occupiers' liability can also leave trespassers with limited protection as shown in Tomlinson v. Congleton Borough Council. The law of occupiers' liability is fair as it requires occupiers to take reasonable steps to protect visitors from foreseeable risks, which is shown in the case of Wheat v. Laken. However, the law of occupiers' liability is unfair as it can deny compensation where individuals voluntarily accept obvious risks, which is shown in the case of Tomlinson v. Congleton Borough Council. The law of occupiers' liability balances competing interests as it protects visitors from harm while recognizing that occupiers should not be insurers of safety, which is shown in the case of Tomlinson v. Congleton Borough Council. However, it may not balance competing interests as it can prioritize occupier freedom over visitor safety, which is shown in the case of Rolls v. Nathan. The aims of the law of occupiers' liability are to compensate injured visitors, encourage safe premises, and limit unreasonable burdens on occupiers. The law of occupiers' liability achieves its own aims as it encourages occupiers to maintain safe environments for visitors, which is shown in the case of Glasgow Corporation v. Taylor. However, it does not achieve its own aims as it may fail to compensate injured individuals who knowingly take risks, which is shown in the case of Tomlinson v. Congleton Borough Council. The law of occupiers' liability achieves the aims of tort law as it promotes compensation and deterrence, which is shown in the case of Wheat v. Laken. However, it does not achieve the aims of tort law as it can leave injured parties without a remedy due to policy considerations, which is shown in the case of Tomlinson v. Congleton Borough Council. An advantage of the law of vicarious liability is that it ensures victims are compensated by financially secure employers as shown in Lister v. Hesley Hall Limited. Another advantage is that it encourages employers to manage and train employees properly, as shown in Century Insurance v Northern Ireland Road Transport Board. As well as this, vicarious liability also promotes fairness by placing liability on those who create risk through business activities, as shown in Mohammed v W.M. Morrison Supermarkets plc. However, a disadvantage of the law of vicarious liability is that employers may be held liable for acts they did not authorize, as shown in Lister v Hesley Hall Limited. Another disadvantage is that it can be difficult to determine whether someone is an employee or independent contractor, as shown in Ready Mixed Concrete v Minister of Pensions. As well as this, liability may be extended too far through broad interpretations of course of employment, as shown in Mohammed v W.M. Morrison Supermarkets plc. The law of vicarious liability is fair as it allows injured claimants to receive compensation from employers who are better able to pay, which is shown in the case of Lister v Hesley Hall Limited. However, the law of vicarious liability is unfair as it can impose liability on employers for deliberate wrongdoing by employees, which is shown in the case of Mohammed v W.M. Morrison Supermarkets plc. The law of vicarious liability balances competing interests as it compensates victims while still requiring a close connection between the employee's actions and their employment, which is shown in the case of Lister v Hesley Hall Limited. However, it may not balance competing interests as it can prioritize claimant compensation over employer fairness, which is shown in the case of Mohammed v W.M. Morrison Supermarkets plc. The aims of the law of vicarious liability are to compensate victims, deter unsafe practices, and distribute loss to those who create risk. The law of vicarious liability achieves its own aims as it ensures effective compensation by holding employers responsible for employee wrongdoing, which is shown in the case of Lister v Hesley Hall Limited. However, it does not achieve its own aims as it can discourage business activity by creating excessive liability for employers, which is shown in the case of Mohammed v W.M. Morrison Supermarkets plc. The law of vicarious liability achieves the aims of tort law as it provides compensation and deterrence, which is shown in the case of Century Insurance v Northern Ireland Road Transport Board. However, it does not achieve the aims of tort law as it can undermine corrective justice by imposing liability without fault, which is shown in the case of Mohammed v W.M. Morrison Supermarkets plc. The similarities between the law of liability in negligence and the law of occupiers liability are that both are based on the duty of care, both require harm to be reasonably foreseeable, and both aim to compensate claimants for personal injury or damage caused by a breach of that duty. However, the differences are that negligence applies broadly to all relationships while occupiers liability applies only to those controlling premises. Occupiers liability is governed by statute while negligence is largely common law. An occupier's liability can be satisfied by warnings whereas negligence usually cannot. The similarities between the law of liability in negligence and the law of vicarious liability are that both are part of tort law, both aim to compensate victims for harm suffered, and both involve assessing responsibility for wrongful conduct. However, the differences are that negligence is fault-based while vicarious liability can impose liability without fault. Negligence focuses on the defendant's own actions while vicarious liability focuses on the actions of another, and negligence applies to individuals and organizations while vicarious liability mainly applies to employers. The similarities between the law of occupiers liability and the law of vicarious liability are that both can impose liability without personal fault, both aim to ensure claimants are compensated, and both place responsibility on those who control risk. However, the differences are that occupiers liability relates to dangers on premises while vicarious liability relates to employee wrongdoing. Occupiers liability is mainly statutory while vicarious liability is common law, and occupiers liability depends on visitor status while vicarious liability depends on the employment relationship. Thank you for watching this video on the evaluation on tort law. I'll see you in the next one.